So let's say I have the task of, let's say someone gives me an integer, right? Someone gives me an integer, there are two integers, and they want me to add those two integers and give back the result. But I don't know what those two integers are right off the bat, right? These guys are going to be giving them. So how would so there's a concept called a function. So it kind of works like in math where you have equivalence, right? Only, you don't only have one variable that you work with. You can have as many as you need in your function. So the syntax for it in Java is, so you have a return type here. Then you have a name. Then you have argument. You open and then close. Right? So make a basic function first. Make a function where let's call it calculator, right? And we want to add two numbers that we're taking as arguments. So following this, if we're adding two numbers, let's say they're integers, what do you want to return? What's the result? You add two integers, what's the result going to be? Sum, which is what type? Integer. Yeah, you have to specify the type of the variable that you're using. So, yeah, int calculator. And then, what are we going to name our arguments? We can have it. Right? So then, okay, what do we do now? So these are the arguments that we're passing into the function, right? What can we do with those arguments? We have to return the sum, right? So, yeah, just like add them. Yeah. So, what do you want to do after you add them? Bracket 6 first plus 7. That's good, but I have to store it somewhere, right? How do I store it?
As a variable.
What?
As a variable.
Okay, so what do I do?
Just like any variable like that.
Right. Okay. How do I return? So the return types work as follows. There's a keyword in Java called return, and you use it inside of a function when you want the function to stop executing and give back whatever value you put after return. So we're going to give back an integer in this case, right? So we can say return sum as our function, right? And then let's say I want to call this function. So let's say I have a name here, right? Let's say add it. Let's say I want to call this, right? For the sake of simplicity, okay, we'll get into it later, but you can't actually call this unless you don't worry about this modifier for now, we'll go over it later. But just to make it like, if you want to make it compile inside of the program, so whatever you need that keyword there. So let's say, so my calculator returns the sum, right? So I can say int sum equals calculator. What do you want to pass in? We can pass in integers, right? Just give me two numbers.
10 and 20.
Okay. And 20. that should print out 30, right? Okay, let's test it on Eclipse. What's it like?
I don't know. Mr. Robinson, what is the ACM cable?
You know how it works, right? Yeah, Avi, now I'm just gonna get
Okay.
Scott.
Yeah, okay. Oh. Okay.
Do I just get up and turn it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's start up the clip. So let's make a new class. We can call it first function, right? So inside this class, we would have another function, int calculator. Right, and so it's going to give us an error because it says this method must return a type of int, right? Because we said the return type is int here. What if we don't want to, or we'll get into that later. First, let's finish this. Int sum equals first plus. Alright, so like I told you guys, this is going to give us an error unless we put a static in front of the int. So don't worry about why we're using the static for now, we'll get into that later. For now, let's see if this will work. So yeah, it prints out 30 as expected, right? So now what happens if we want to have a function that doesn't require any returning, right? Let's say I have a function called print, but I don't want a return type, right? So I would say it was void. So the term, see, so you guys have to realize that the main itself is also a function, right? Because you have a return type, you see it, you have your modifiers here. You guys don't have to worry about modifiers yet. And then you have your return type, which is void, which means that it doesn't return anything. And then you have your arguments over here, your string array arguments. And the reason why you have a string array as your arguments is when you're running Java programs in your terminal, all the arguments that you pass in are technically strings, right? The program takes it and converts it into whatever type that you specify, but it takes it in originally as strings. That's why your main function takes in strings. Or a string array. And we're going to go over arrays, not today, maybe some other time, but this is an argument as well. So we have our print function, right? Why is it giving it, can anyone tell me why it's giving us an error right now, our print function? Yeah?
Assigning it twice.
No, it's not that I'm assigning it twice. This one?
Is it taking that break as a return time?
Well, there's two reasons for it.
Or is it because of static?
No, it's not because it's static. That's the error over here. Okay, so there's two things that are wrong with the code right here. First, I need a return type, right? I need to specify what type you're returning. So that'll solve the first issue. The second issue is you're still returning something, but you're telling the program that it's not returning something. So the compiler is going to complain because you're telling it that it's not going to return anything, but then you're returning something within the code. Does that make sense? So let's say I want to print out the sum, right? And we have to make this static still because, well, we'll go over why later. Okay. And then why is it giving me an error now?
It's like you named it print and then it's a lot of people calling it.
Yeah, we changed the name, so change this back to print. Why is it giving me an error now?
Because you actually, it doesn't really return anything and then you're giving it values.
Yeah, so if you're assigning this to a variable, it should return something, right? In this case, it's not returning anything, so we can't set anything equal to it because we would be setting our integer sum equal to void, right? So we would get rid of this entirely. We don't need that. Now what's wrong with the code? Why is it giving me another error?
Oh, because sum is not returning.
Yeah, sum was no longer defined, right? So we can't use this anymore. So this should print out 30. And we get 30. So that's exactly what we want. Now let's try another exercise where, let me think. Let me think. Okay, alright, here's what I want you guys to do. So let's build an app that works as a complete calculator, not just for one operation. Okay, so I want you guys to either code on paper with me or use a laptop. Okay, so let's start by writing out what we want to do. Let's start by writing out what we want to do. So we want to be able to specify operation, right? Because in a calculator you can specify what operation you're trying to do, right? We want to be able to conduct the specified operation, and we want to return the result of the specified operation. Right? Is there anything else a calculator should do? Just for basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division? No? Okay. Alright, so let's start. So let's start by making a function. So what do we want to make this, so start with static. And what do you want this function to be able to return? An integer. What if I divide 5 by 2? Is that an integer?
So should we use double?
Yeah. So let's try using a double here. A double. And then let's call it calculate. And then our arguments can be int first, second,
Should we also leave the doubles?
Well, you tell me, are 5 and 2 doubles? Do they have to be doubles for our purposes?
No.
I mean, we can definitely make them if we want to be able to add like 2.5 and 3.7, right?
Yes.
So I mean, there's no harm. Yeah, let's go ahead and make them doubles. So it's going to complain right now because we're not returning anything, but we promised it that we would return something, right? So it's going to say we have to have a return type of double. Is that all this thing we'll need to do? Don't we also need to be able to specify the operation that we need to do, right? It's pretty abstract as to what it's going to do, right? We just called it a calculate function. So how would the user be able to communicate with our function to tell it that I want to do addition, for instance? How would we be able to identify? How would we be able to tell the program that we're doing addition? Why would you use a scanner?
Maybe it's what it is.
I want the user to be able to tell the function what operation we're going to do. So we would pass it in through the main function, right? How could the function read what operation the user wants the function to do? How could we communicate with the function? What data type can we use to communicate with the function what operation we're going to use?
Like, do you want to set up like 4 different variables that do the different operations, and then you just set it up?
What do you mean by 4 different variables?
Like, say here's sum 1, like sum, and then you do addition, and then like it divides, and then you get that.
Okay, so you have 4 variables for each of the operations. How do you know which one to return? Okay, well we're trying to communicate a word here, right? We want to tell our program that we're going to do addition or subtraction, right? How can we communicate words in Java?
Straight, I guess.
Yeah, so we use a string. So we also pass in a string operation. Alright, we'll just call this calc. Okay, so now we have all of our arguments here. So let's start the function. So how am I going to start this off? I need 4 different cases, right? I need a different case if it's addition, I need a different case if it's subtraction, a different case if it's multiplication, and a different case if it's division. So what kind of construct have we learned so far that would allow us to segment our code in such a way? If I do something, I want to do that. If I want to do something else, I want to do something else, right? So what construct would we use?
So if else.
Yeah, we're using if else. If else. So if operation dot equals and if you guys are wondering what this if you guys are wondering what the dot equals is, when you're comparing strings, you always want to use dot equals instead of equals equals, because normally when we want to say something like, we want to say int a equals 5, and then let's say I want to test if a equals 5, right? So that's the normal test that I would put inside a Boolean expression with 2 equal signs. But when we're using strings, we'll go over the exact reasons why later, but for Java 6, or for Java versions 1.6 and below, you have to use dot equals. You can't use the normal syntax. So dot equals addition, right? Then you would do return first plus second, right? Right? And then what's the second condition? What else could it be equal to? What other operations are there?
You can do else operation equals to subtraction.
Else if operation dot equals that. Else if what?
Operation equals multiplication.
Multiplication. Return first times second. And else if, or what else would we do?
Just else.
Just else?
Yeah.
Alright, let's try that. So let's try this function and see what's right.
Wait, you did
Okay, so let's call system. By the way, you can nest functions. So you notice that this printline function itself is a void function, right? Void, and it's a function because it takes in an argument. So we can put inside here, we can put calc, and then we can pass in our argument. So let's say I want to pass in 5.5, 6.5, and addition.
Wait, whatever you put an if, do you need to have an else with it, or you don't need to?
We'll get into that. We'll see. So 5.5 plus 6.5 is what? Well, that goes there, and then it's 12. So our program is working fine. What's going to happen if I put subtraction? What will my result be? It'll be -1, right? Why is it that?
Oh, you wrote first equals second?
Yup. You're right. So first minus second, so now it should print -1, right? Alright, there we go. So it's working as we expected. So let's try multiplying them. Oh, oops. So this should print out the product, right? 35.75, whatever it is.
We didn't do it for division.
Why does it still work?
Well, because like whatever, like it's not one of the strings that we set up there, so it's just gonna go to the else.
So what if I put this? Oops. It's the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So are we supposed to use an else statement in that case?
No.
No, right? What would we use up here?
Another if.
Yeah. Else if what?
Operation equals division.
Okay, so that should technically work, right? So let's disregard the error it's giving us right now and run it anyways. But it tells us there's an unresolved compilation problem. The method must return a type of double. But see, over here, every single case that we think will occur, we're already returning, right? So why does the program tell us that we need to return a type? Any guesses? What would happen in the case where I had the previous string? What if I just had that? Would that be handled by our code? Yes or no?
No.
Okay. So if it's not handled by our code, then how does our code know what to return? We already promised that we would return a type double, right? So we have to return a type double within our function. But the code has no guarantee that we're going to return, right? So it's panicking and it's telling us, okay, you have to have a return type to back up to, right? So we have to have an else statement here, and we have to return something else. So what do you guys want to return if they pass in some random string?
Like, it's not possible.
You could say something like, we could print out a message. We could say print out,
No, like,
please enter a valid operation. What would we do after here? We still have to return something, right? How could we return a value? What could we possibly want to return in this case? Peter, do you know? You know? What would we want to return in this case? This is our backup, right? If nothing else matches the string that we pass in, we have to have a backup. Otherwise, the function won't be guaranteed that it can return something. So what value could we possibly return? Millie, do you know? 0? Well, let's say I have the operation abhinav. Is that a defined math operation?
no.
So would that operation really return 0 for the values 5.5 and 6.5?
Wait, is there a way to return system that's not as well?
Well, you have to return a value, right? You can't return void, that defeats the purpose of return, right? But what's the return type of print line? What does print line return? It's void, right? So you can't return a void thing because that completely defeats the purpose of returning. Any other guesses as to what we could return in our else statement? Anand? No, void? No. Okay, so we're able to, in Java, or in basically any programming language, we're able to just have the return statement by itself. What's this? Must return a type of double. Okay, so let's say we're executing through some code, right? Let's say we're executing through like a for loop. This is actually a bad example. Return -1, and then so how? Okay, yeah. Okay. So let's say so we would handle it here. Yeah, so we would handle it in our main function in this case, because the way we would do it otherwise would be different. Okay, so we would do if, okay, so we would store it, right? So return the type of double, result. And then what could we do to guarantee that something would be printed out? We could say if result equals -1. Well, we don't need to do anything, right? Because we're already printing out that there. So we could just do system.out if result is not equal to 1. And then we can print line result. Do you guys think that'll work for all cases? Why? The numbers that we use here, if we use subtraction, right? So what will this code print out? Would it print out negative 1.0? I say it'd print out nothing.
Like you're subtracting 5.5 and 6.5.
So what's the result of 5.5 minus 6.5?
1.0.
Negative 1.0, right? So in our main function itself, we're saying if the result is not equal to negative 1, then we print out. But if it is equal to negative 1, then this if statement won't execute, right? The result not equal to negative 1.
But it'll never be, right? Because it's all double.
No, it'll print out nothing. Because negative 1.0 is equal to negative 1, right? So this code will print out nothing. So what do you guys think a valid value would be for this calculator to return if it's not a valid operation?
Something divided by 0. That's like undefined.
Not quite. For now, okay, so there's these things called exceptions that we'll learn about later. But for now, we can just say, for now, honestly, we can just keep it at this. Because we can assume that the user will know what operations are. Because right now we don't have the tools necessary to be able to put every case in there and then complain if they don't follow the format that you give them. But for now, this should work fine. Why is it still giving me that though? Because we still have this in the main, right? So we take that out. And we run. Now we got negative 1.0. Is everyone good? Does everyone get it?
What are some uses like of functions?
What are some uses of functions?
Yeah.
Let me think. So they get really useful later on when we learn about what classes are. But for now, you can use them to do like cool tricks. Like, okay, so I guess a formal way to tell you what the use of functions are is, let's say I have something that I'm repeating in my code several times, right? I have the same exact code, and I'm using it several times inside my code, right?
What's like a method?
Methods are functions,
Oh,
basically.
so basically it's to refer back to something.
It's to compartmentalize your code in such a way that you don't have to repeat useless code. Like, what if every time I want to do this calculating thing, I could have all these if statements inside here, right? And I could check every single time, every time I want to print out the result. Or I could put all of the code into a function, and I would need one line of code every time I needed to use all of that code, right?
Yeah.
So it's just a way to organize your code so that if you need to use something multiple times, it's easy to use and fast to access. Does that make sense?
So is there a difference between methods and functions or
No.
exact same thing?
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's debatable. We'll talk more about that when we get into objects and classes, which I think will be after winter break. Yeah. So are there any other questions on functions? Does everyone understand the basic concepts of functions? Would you like another example? Or do you think you guys get it? Yes or no?
Okay.
You're okay? What about you guys not talking?
I guess we could just practice somewhere else.
Home. Peters, do you need help? Do you want to do another example? Sure. Alright, let's do one more example and then we call it a day. Let me think. give me a minute. Let me think a little bit example. Alright, so remember that code that we wrote earlier to determine whether or not you could, like, depending on your grade, you would get a certain statement, right? Let's make that into a function. We'll make a new class, and we'll call it, grade. This one's, I don't know. So, let's have a function that returns a string. And let's call it print, and you pass in a string grade. Who's gonna complain because we aren't passing back a string, right, with our return statement? Yeah. So let's say so here's how we, this is actually a good example. So here's how we do it. So how do we start our code off? If what? What do we do if our grade is equal to A? Yeah.
She's getting an error, even though she's returning double.
Okay, raise your hand then. Let me come and check.
Not returning anything to the stack of equals to. You have if in your account, then why would you not equal either of you? Yeah, if you have questions, you guys have to raise your hands, because otherwise it might go unchecked and then, that's funny, unchecked. Sorry, okay. So if grade is equal to A, then what? Then we print out, what do you guys want, or we return, I don't know, good job. Else if grade So let's do this the cool way. Grade dot equals C or grade dot equals B or grade dot equals F. If any of those are true, then we would system.out.println try harder. Right? Okay. So now we can finally address the case using some, okay, so let's say they enter something that's not a valid grade. So let's give them an error message. We can do system.error.println just to make ourselves cool. Make that in red. System.error.println enter valid grade. And then remember the problem that we had earlier, nothing in the backup case? We can do so there's a construct in Java called null, where null just means you're not returning anything, right? So why is it giving us an error? Must return in the type string, okay. Okay, never mind. We'll go back to this example when you learn about objects. Yeah, because so there's a so for now we can just return. So actually we don't need to do that, right? We can just return what would we return? Enter a valid. And I actually did this wrong. This isn't system.out.println, this is return.
Okay, so let's test our function now. Remember we have to make it static for now. We'll go in a while later. And then we would say system. Alright, so let's try and see if it'll work. And yep, so Prince had a good job, so we're doing that part right. So let's try this part over here. So let's see what happens if we put a C. Try harder, right? And look what happens if we put a D. Try harder, and if we put an S. Try harder, what if we put an E? So let's enter a val grade. So our code is working fine, right? Does that make sense to you guys? So the reason we use a function for this is because we don't want to reiterate all of this stuff over and over again every time we want to print the corresponding message with the grade. Does that make sense? Yeah. So to touch up a bit on what I was going over before, null is just something that represents nothing, if that makes sense. Like, so it gets really important. Like, so let's say, I talked about hexadecimal last week, right? So it's like when you're storing something, the address in memory is stored in hexadecimal, right? What if I'm pointing to some place in memory that's not meaningful? That would be processed as null by Java. So null by Java, like the null construct in Java, it's just a way to express nothing. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, I think we're good then. If you guys have any questions, just email me.